Our next presenter is Bailee Highbarger. Bailee will share music's effects on effort put into workouts by student athletes. Bailee's mentor is Dr. Kristina Mouzakis. Before we begin, will you please silence your phones? And after Bailee's presentation, she will invite you to ask questions. Bailee, I'll turn it over to you.
Good morning. As she said, I'll be presenting to you music's effect on effort put into workout by student athletes. So I chose this research topic because the exact day that Dr. Mouzakis asked us to pick, I had actually just come to weights where the speaker system was broken and had to do the entire workout without music, and I noticed a large difference in myself. So I thought that would be a good question to pose. So I started with the literature review. And the first four sources that I found were kind of the main things I wanted to study. So the first one was a study done, and it actually tested music in the sense of confidence. So it found that music increases confidence in people, and it actually gives athletes more motor coordination to complete a workout. And then the second study that I found actually found that the genre of music really matters. They did a study where they tested athletes using pop music, rap music, and country music, and found that pop music was actually the best music to work out to, which I thought was interesting because I would definitely pick country if I would have been in that study. The third source that I found to be helpful actually did a study on track athletes, and it tested their running times using concentration. So it tested them with music, and it found that it heightens their concentration, allowing them to run faster and longer. And then the last source actually used music before the actual competition, so it was more of a mental warm-up. And it found that music reduces stress, which increases effort, which is the main part of my study. And so I thought that the literature itself on this topic never studied the four factors that I had together, but it did touch on all of them. So the research questions I posed the day we were asked, the first one was, does listening to music help student athletes put more effort into their workout? The second question I asked was, does music being played in the weight room provide the effort student athletes need to finish their workouts? Off of those two questions, I was able to create an alternative directional hypothesis, and that was student athletes are more likely to complete their more repetitions in their workout when music is present versus when music is not. Along with this, I created a null hypothesis, which says there's no difference between music and effort. Null hypothesis simply means it's not directional, and it just implies that there is no difference. So to start with the methodology, in my experiment itself, I needed the athletes to not be aware of what I was asking them. I needed to deceive them in a way. The actual weight program was not out of their normal routine. They would have been at weights anyway when I was conducting the experiment. But I did start weights kind of explaining to them a little bit of what I was asking, and then gave them a survey to deceive them, which I will touch on in a minute. So the participants there was 18 participants for this study, and they were all on the QU women's softball team. Again, this was part of their weight program that was normally in their day, and the movement that I chose to study was actually hand-raised push-ups. I will show you a video in a second to kind of explain what that is for anyone who doesn't know. And I did 2 rounds of that hand-raised push-up motion. So each round was 30 seconds. The first round had no music, with a lot of complaints from my fellow teammates, and the second round was with music. So in this video, this is the actual video I found online to study the movement itself and be able to explain it. So he's going to go down, he's going to start in push-up position, go down to the floor. He's going to raise his hands from the floor, bring them by his shoulder blades, put them back on the ground, and then go back up in a push-up, and continually do that motion over and over. Again, the limit was 30 seconds, so they did it as many times as they could before the time stopped. My coach was helpful in this aspect, as she was kind of the one who held the timer and did all that, as I had to do it with my team. I can't just skip the workout just because I was running the study. So like I mentioned, I did do a survey for deception. I asked 4 demographic questions and then 5 questions, and I actually said I was studying leadership's effects in the weight room. Everyone believed it, so I guess it really worked out for me. Well, the first demographic question that I asked was the age of the participants. So I found that I had 5 18-year-olds, 1 19-year-old, 5 20-year-olds, 6 21-year-olds, and 1 22-year-old. And then another demographic question was the year in school. So we had 8 freshmen, 2 sophomores, 5 juniors, and 3 seniors in this study. And then talking about the 5 questions that I asked that were more geared toward the leadership question, I thought it'd be interesting to share that with you guys today just because it was another piece of data I was able to study. So the first question was, do you feel that your coach effectively talks to you in the weight room? They were multiple choice answers, so A was completely, B was somewhat, and C was not at all. As you can see from this question, most people completely or somewhat felt that our coach effectively talks to them. The second question was, do you feel that working out with your team is better than working out alone? Again, you see the majority of people answered completely to this question. The third question, do you feel more motivated by the workouts written by your coach? So this one, we actually had a couple people say not at all, but the majority still went to completely. And then the fourth question, do you feel like there are obvious leaders among your teammates while in the weight room? This was a little bit shocking to me. I definitely thought the answer was going to be completely, but the majority was somewhat. And then the final question I asked in the deception survey was, do you become more motivated by the present leadership as the workout progresses? Again, the answer was somewhat most of the time. So I just thought that was interesting to share. I didn't really expect anything from those answers. It just gave me the ability to run some correlations for my actual data. So looking at the experiment that I ran, these are the 2 different trials. So trial 1 was without music, trial 2 was with music. So I actually color coordinated this. I started my research by eyeballing, which is not completely correct, but I did run other data with it. So I color coordinated, and the blue highlighted sections represent numbers that were equal in the first round and the second round. The green numbers represent people who improved in their number in the second round, and the yellow represent people who did better in the first round than in the second round. And then just to point out on the bottom, I ran the means and standard deviations for both of those, which comes into play later in my data. So now talking about the results. For our actual research, we chose to use an Excel spreadsheet. It's provided through the school, so it was an easy means to run the data that we needed. And then the second thing that I did, like I just mentioned, was the color coordination for the different trials. I just found this to be really helpful when I started running the difference scores. The difference scores is an actual calculated difference between the round 1 and round 2 for each individual participant. This allowed me to see if my eyeballing and color coordination was in fact correct. Along with the difference scores that I ran means and standard deviations for as many of the questions and trials as I could. So I ran means and standard deviations for round 1 and round 2, along with running them for the actual difference scores themselves. Allowing me to run the means and standard deviations allowed me to run a dependent samples t-test. A dependent samples t-test just means that the rounds were reliant on one another. So the scores connected to one another, so therefore I was able to run a dependent samples t-test. On the side, you can see the actual equation that I used. I'm not going to get too into it because I don't have the numbers up there presently, but if you have more questions about that, you can let me know. And then the last thing I did within my results was actually some correlations, like I mentioned. So I ran correlations between the year in school and trial 1 and the age of the participants in trial 1. And then I did the same for trial 2. That was just to get some more experience running the data. I'm not going to go heavily into that because it didn't find much. Again, the numbers were kind of just 1 through 3, so it didn't really get me very far. So going more into my results, with the t-test, the first thing you have to do is find a t-obtained. So I ran with the formula that I had on the last slide, and my t-obtained, as you can see, is extremely small. If you round it to the 100th, it's still 0.000. So with that, I then found my t-critical, which is obviously larger. It's on the bottom. It's a 2.11. This means that I fail to reject my null hypothesis, or I retain it. So the null, as I stated earlier, is that there is no difference. So in my data, I found that there wasn't enough data to actually reject the null hypothesis and say there was a difference. The p-value also is bigger than the alpha in this situation, so the alpha would be a 0.05. The p-value is 0.99, and since the p is bigger than the a, it also ensures that we have to fail to reject the null. The best thing about my data when I was looking at this was actually the Pearson's R. So the Pearson's R is the effect size, and effect size just means the magnitude that the outside world and other factors are affected by the number that you receive in your data. So my effect size was 0.672, which is a medium to large effect size. So it ranges from 0 to 1, and anything above 0.5 would be medium, and then 0.8 is large. So this is medium to large, which shows that there's a high probability that there could be a connection between my factors. So moving into the discussion, again, I wanted to re-show you the null hypothesis, that there is no difference between music and effort. We failed to reject that due to the T obtained, T critical, p-value, and alpha. So writing it out in APA style, we find that T of 17 is our degrees of freedom, is again extremely low, 0.00. And then the P is larger than our alpha, and the effect size is 0.672. So I already kind of discussed the significance of Pearson's R, but again, the effect size shows us in this experiment that with more data, more participants, there could be a positive connection here. So to continue on, I also had a lot of limitations to my experiment. So the first main one I noticed was the participant size. I was only able to obtain 18 people. To continue the experiment with the effect size that I was given, you would need more participants. And then the second thing I noticed was the training level. Everyone weighs differently on their own. Everyone trains differently. Some people can do push-ups, some people can't. Therefore, the training level was kind of difficult, as the hand-raised push-ups aren't something that's normally in our weight program. They were added for the day. So I found that to be difficult as well. And then the third thing was operational definition. So in an experiment, you always need to operationalize everything and define it. I struggled with this for the word effort. It's really difficult to define effort as it looks different for everyone. That's why I decided to do repetitions. It was easier to define in a way when you have it put with numbers. I also noticed extreme issues with external validity. Again, only had 18 participants from one school for one team, so you can't really say that this could extend further than the team that I studied. And then the last thing was I would have loved to do this experiment without deception. However, I couldn't just tell the participants what I needed from them, because if I tell them I needed them to do better with the music, that would have ruined the entire experiment. So looking into future research, again, the effect size, Pearson's R, tells us there's positive insight and a probable connection between what I studied. This medium to large effect size could tell us that with more participants and more data, you would be able to find a connection and you would be able to reject the null hypothesis. In this case, I think having multiple different sports and possibly multiple schools you'd be able to obtain the data you needed. The next thing for future research is the workout movement. I found this to be an extremely difficult thing to decide upon because if you put weight on a bar, everyone would have different weight they'd be able to lift, which caused problems. But then again, I also found problems that everyone weighed differently anyway. So I think that looking more into what movement would be best to perform would be something to look into. Another thing was the state of exhaustion. I found a lot of the players coming up to tell me that they were already too tired to do any more in the workout. Again, it's not out of their normal routine, but they were still tired by the end of it. And then the last thing was preparation for injuries. So we do have 25 people on our team. I did, in fact, forget that 3 of them have shoulder injuries and some of them have back injuries. Therefore, the experiment itself lacked participants. So I was already down by 6 in the beginning from what I should have had, so that caused issues. And then I came up with 3 questions that when I was going through the data, I was like, oh, I wish I would have looked into this, or here's a question I have for further research. So the first is, will this experiment be reliable across all sports and exercises? You could say that this would work for everything, but again, I only did one movement, and I only did one sport. So maybe soccer would be different than softball, and if you did a leg movement, it would be more measurable. The second question is, how many participants are needed to create a high external validity with these factors? Again, I'm not sure you could really obtain an exact number needed, but with more research, you might be able to answer that question. And then the third question is, would there be a fair way to even the expectations? This just goes back to what I was talking about with people weighing different weights and then some people not knowing how to do the movement properly and others, and then again, injuries. So with that, these are the references that I had used. I discussed 4 of them earlier. I did have 10 overall. And that is all that I have for my presentation. Thank you for attending. And if anyone has any questions for me, I'd love to answer them.
Did you have to run this past an institutional review board?
Yes, I did. So I actually filled out an IRB form, and in that I did explain the deception that I used in the survey and explain the different movements that I would be using, and that's where I gave my operational definitions. But yes, I did run it past the school IRB board.
I have a caveat for that. So you wrote an IRB, but we didn't submit it to the school IRB board.
Oh.
But we...
That's too bad. It's okay.
Yes.
It's okay.
But we got away with it because it was for a class. So she did this research for a class project. I have a question. So you said something about exhaustion. Is it correct that you ran trial 1 and trial 2 on the same day, sequentially?
Yes, I did. So I ran them. They were each the 30-second trials, like I said. So they did the 30-second round and then had a minute rest and then the next 30-second round, which is common for our sport. That's how we do most of our workouts. That's why I decided to base it that way.
And so how could you have avoided those exhaustion effects because you had everybody do one thing first and then the second thing second?
So when I was actually looking at that, I think it would have to be done maybe on a sports off day or a day where they do less activity. We had our entire weight program, which consists of like 15 to 20 other movements before I did my experiment. So therefore they were tired from the actual weights program itself. So I think I would have done it on an off day or a day where they had less, they were being asked less of their bodies.
And then again, so you had all women on your study, or
Yes, I did.
Women identifying, or I guess females. Do you think you would have gotten different results if you had had all men or mixed?
There was nothing on that in the research that I was doing, but I was interested in that at all. I think I would have liked to study more teams. The football team did not allow me to input my different workout into their workout, so I wasn't able to study that. But I do think there would be different results. But again, like I said, different sports use different muscles commonly. So I think finding a common movement for all of them to do to be able to measure would be extremely difficult. Thank you for attending my presentation.
Thank you, Bailee. We will take a short break and start again at 11 o'clock. Thank you.